The Housing and Community Economic Development Committee will now come to order. What the heck is that? Somebody's recording this? Well, you have the right to do so. Just turn it down. Okay. This is a one-item agenda. I'd like to first open up public comment on general public comment first. No? None? No, nobody here for general public comment? General public comment for this committee is now open. That's where people from the community can come and speak to items that are not agendized in this committee, but are the purview of this committee. Is there no one here to speak on general public comment? Okay, there's not. General public comment is closed. Okay. Now, please read into the record item number 1, please.
Sure. Michael Keck, CLA's office. Item number 1, communication from the mayor and CAO to report relative to results of the gang reduction and youth development grid request for proposals for the citywide gang prevention and intervention services, and authorization to negotiate and execute contracts for the period of October 1st, 2012 to June 30th, 2013, and authorization to amend the contract with Communities and Schools, Inc. in the Valley Secondary Area with the revised end period of December 31st, 2012.
Thank you very much. If staff can come forward so they can present on this item. Also, I'd like to mention to my colleagues and to the staff with the city that the services have commenced as of October 1st. As you're very, very well aware, many of these bidders are organizations that are specialty organizations, but they don't necessarily have resources to carry them for months at a time. So I think it's important that we respect that and appreciate that, and so that hopefully we can go through this item today, and then we can get it on the calendar of the council as soon as possible. Once again. Okay, we're looking to put it on this Friday. Yes. Thank you, Mr. President. So with that, we'll have a presentation from the staff and then questions from the committee, and then we'll go to public comment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think Mildred will go through the nuts and bolts of the RFP process, but as you stated, these are cost reimbursement contracts, and we're primarily dealing with small nonprofits that don't have the cash flow, and they're in the front line, so these are precisely the nonprofits that we need to deal with. We went through a rigorous RFP process, and what we're presenting today really constitutes, it's asking for the authority to move forward and execute these contracts so that folks can continue doing the work. The work has not been interrupted, and even though the contracts formally start October 1st, agencies have continued to do the work. So, Mildred, if you could go through the RFP.
Also, I'd just like to point out, it's my understanding that this is within the scope and budget that we approved
that
and was signed by the mayor, right?
That is correct.
So we're not talking about monies outside of the approved budget. The only thing that we have is a $20,000 transfer from Recreation and Parks, of which my office transferred over from discretionary funds to Recreation and Parks for a certain activity during the summer, and we're going to be transferring those $20,000 over to one of the intervention groups, correct?
Correct.
For work that they have already done.
That is correct.
Okay. So I just wanted to point that out, members, that even though when we're looking through these numbers, they're in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, they are within what has already been budgeted for this activity. Go ahead, Mildred.
Okay. So we are reporting
Your name
on...
again, for the record?
Mildred Lopez with the Mayor's Grid Office. So we are reporting on 2 separate requests for proposals that were issued out of our office. The first is a request for proposal to provide gang prevention or intervention services within the grid zones across the city of Los Angeles. For a majority of the grid zones, they've already begun providing services. There were just a few grid zones that we needed additional time to complete the process, and those included the Southwest 2 grid zone, and we're proposing to contract with Brotherhood Crusade to provide gang prevention services. And for the Rampart grid zone, which we're proposing to split the funding equally between Brzee Foundation and El Centro del Pueblo. And as Guillermo stated, these are contracts that will start effective October 1st all the way up until the end of the fiscal year, June 30th, 2013. The additional request for proposal was issued back in January originally because of a lack of proposals that were received. We reissued the request for proposal under the advisement of our city attorney, and it was within our right to reissue that. We indicated that there was a new due date, which was in March of 2012. We received proposals, which in the transmittal are a list of agencies that submitted proposals for review. And we are reporting the results for each of the secondary area regions, including Central, South, Valley, and West. For Central, we are proposing to contract with Youth Policy Institute, all for an amount, all of these agencies will receive an amount up to $253,125. In the South region, we wish to continue our contract with Watts Labor Community Action Committee, otherwise known as WLCAC. In the San Fernando Valley, we wish to continue our contract with Child and Family Guidance Center, and for the West region, we've identified a new contractor, Children's Hospital Los Angeles.
Now, that's for prevention-oriented work, not intervention.
Correct,
Prevention.
prevention. For intervention for our secondary areas, for the Central region, we wish to contract with Public Health Foundation Enterprise / Aztecs Rising. In the South region, Toberman Neighborhood Center, and we've allocated additional funding as a result of a greater need for intervention services. In the Valley, we will continue our relationship with Communities and Schools, and in the West with Venice 2000 Helper Foundation. So we have a total of a little under $700,000 going towards intervention funding in these secondary areas.
So on that note, since you mentioned some of the names of the groups and some of the names have changed and/or combined their efforts, correct, in some parts of the city?
Well, in the prevention area, what we've done in the central area, in the Rampart Grid Zone, is that given that several providers applied, 2 providers applied, and after 2 rounds of interviews and panel discussions, they came in tied. So we're splitting that contract between them. In addition, Youth Policy Institute was awarded the secondary prevention contract for that area. And
Well, my question to you, Guillermo, is have we seen over the last few years, now that we've moved to this system, which I think is getting better every year from the reports I get and the activity on the street, and with the fact that crime's down, and the fact that I think that for example, our LAPD is understanding this better and better
Very
every
much so.
day
Very
from
much
the
so.
top down. Are we finding that some of the organizations may have realized that their work on the street is great, but their administrative capacity
Oh, yeah.
had limitations? And has that caused and allowed them to combine their efforts with other organizations, or
Well,
perhaps have better
they
strength
have.
on the
Well,
back
we've-
end rather than the front?
what we've done, for example, with one organization, intervention organization, they needed about a year to have a fiscal receiver to kind of get their books in order. We basically made an agreement with them for a period of a year. They will be receiving their funding through this fiscal umbrella, and then after a year, the contract will return directly to them. There are other...
Well, not automatically given to them,
No.
but if in fact they bid well and they've shown that
Correct.
they've strengthened their
Correct.
back end, what I call the back end, where the books are done and stuff
Correct.
like that, and accountability. Okay.
During that period of time, we provided a lot of technical assistance on fiscal matters and all of that. So yes, the agencies are finding that it's equally as important to have your work, your paperwork be as tight as your work on the streets. And to some degree, I think we've been fortunate that we've been able to work with frontline agencies, and for the most part, we've had relatively few issues over the last 5 years.
Yes. Okay. Well, I have a question specifically. Can you explain to us why, as Brotherhood Crusade was awarded $675,000 contract, where the other organizations are receiving a $375,000 contract? Why the contrast between those two?
Well, Brotherhood Crusade is a prevention provider, and I think initially we had lots of discussions about the policy of the grid office to invest more funding on the 85% of the youth that will not become gang members, if we can get to them, versus the 15% who are. So Brotherhood Crusade provides family-based services to those youth who are at the highest risk of becoming gang members. Perhaps one of the stronger agencies that we work with, in particular in terms of being able to work with young men. So what they do is prevention. The prevention contracts are $900,000 a year for the grid zone, and the intervention contracts are $500,000 a year.
Okay, my last question before I turn it over to my colleagues, and we'll go to Ms. Perry first, is every year, I think that we're getting more clear about the appeals process. Should there
Correct.
be any bidders who feel that they need to express their continued interest in being reconsidered? Did we have any appeals this year? How did that go? What's the status?
Yes, we did, and Mildred can go through the process of the review, the appeals, the interview, the final decision, and
So every agency that, even the top scoring proposers are given the opportunity to appeal. So if there is a final score within a specific region, they all receive letters of notification indicating that they have a certain amount of days to put together a request for an appeal. We receive that request for appeal, review it for minimum qualifications, and determine that an appeals board will take place. So we did receive requests for appeal, which are included in the document, in the transmittal, and we did hear their cases before an appeals board. And again, the city attorney was a part of this process. They are notified in writing, which includes the results of those appeals. So it can be determined that they will receive additional points in a specific section of their written application. We actually had one case where in the Central Prevention Secondary Area region, that as a result of their request for appeal, they were awarded additional points, and that got them within the 5-point range to determine an interview process. So that's the next level. As soon as the interviews are conducted, then we notify them again in writing, and then they get an additional opportunity to appeal. What's not included in this report is that two regions, the South Intervention Secondary Area and the Central Prevention Secondary Area, received opportunities to appeal. We received one letter from Youth Policy Institute, which was a top proposer, and then they later withdrew their request for an appeal. So it was not necessary for us to hold a second appeals board because we didn't receive any additional requests.
Okay. Do you get the feeling that the bidders in general are understanding better now that there is an appeals process and that the appeals process is robust enough for them to actually vet their concerns? Because I remember we had some appeals in the very, very beginning.
Correct.
And people seemed to be upset and didn't think it was fair or what have you. What's the climate now with the bidders?
well, I think the climate is much better. Having said that, we've put some other processes in place where there's the written proposal, and then we want to meet with agencies to make sure they understand the work and all of that. Having said that, I think in these days, any agency that doesn't get funded, it's very difficult. We don't have enough resources to fund all the agencies that should be funded. But I think besides that, it's my understanding that the communities have been pretty clear about the process. The process has been very transparent. We've had many more years working with our city attorneys, but we've been guided through the process. So I believe we've improved it.
Thank you. Ms. Perry?
Yeah, great. Thank you. And these are some general questions, because we all want this program. It's helped people all over the city. And, we're spending, as you know, we're spending quite a bit of money, over $20 million on this program. And so just in the most general sense, if you can, if you feel that we're achieving the desired results, and how do we know the program's working?
Well, we go through a rigorous evaluation through the Urban Institute in Washington, D.C. every year. I can cite what I think is some pretty impressive numbers from 2011. Our 2012 report will be out December 1. Gang-related crime inside the grid zones has been a 29% reduction when we compare 2007 to 2011. 42% reduction in homicide, in shots fired, and 33% reduction in homicides. This is within the grid zones. When you look at those homicides, the reduction in homicides outside the grid zones has only been 15%. So it's been double the reduction of homicides inside the grid zones. Other measures that look at violence, assault with a deadly weapon against police officers, 48% reduction inside the grid zones, 9% reduction outside the grid zones. In terms of youth, 49% of the youth currently being served have reduced their risk factors below that threshold that makes them at the highest risk of becoming gang members. And that includes specific behaviors like a 48% decrease in participation in gang activities, 35% decrease in hanging out with gang members, 47% decrease in gang fights. One interesting piece of data is that our being able to strengthen parental supervision has had the highest level of reduction because we are really targeting those who are in charge of households to strengthen that unit. So we have moved to a multi-generational approach that we're working with families that to strengthen that. The Summer Night Lights, you've been to all of the parks in your area and all of that since 2008. We've had about 1.8 million visits to these sites. We've served 1.1 million meals. We've made 3,500 jobs available, and the levels of reduction have been 35% in those areas in gang-related Part 1 crime and 35% homicides. Now,
Well, tell me about your goal setting and how you determine whether or not you've reached your goals and within what time frame.
goal setting, I think as we move forward, if I could sidetrack for a minute, about a year ago, I went to a homicide of a young man, and there was I won't name the neighborhood, there was a young girl skipping rope about maybe 50 yards from the yellow tape, completely oblivious to what took place. I had a very weird thought in my mind, which was, what kind of parent would allow a child to be that close to a crime scene? And then I said to myself, that is normal. That is the normal in this situation. So setting goals really has to do with at what point do we start transforming those neighborhoods so that that doesn't become normal anymore. So we're doing great with crime reduction, we're reducing risk factors. That broader neighborhood transformation is what we think the next phase of the work is, so that we establish a new normal. Now, we've seen examples of that in some of the grid zones. The situation, for example, in Baldwin Village, that used to take place several years ago, you don't see that kind of acceptance, if you will, of violent behavior. So, and our goals are also driven by evaluation. So, December, we're not looking at the report. We use that report to kind of as a form of reflection, and then we respond to it. The fact that we're doing multi-generational work has been as a result of the report. So in moving forward, our goals get defined by what the data tells us. We tend to follow the data. There's been some areas that we've stretched the boundaries of the grid zone because of crime data. We spend a lot of time with the crime analysis unit sharing data back and forth. So most everything we do, we try to drive it with the data that's available.
And then the analysis is the analysis always a third-party analysis out of Washington?
That is the Urban Institute in Washington, D.C., and we do a lot of data collection as well, but any data that we collect, they have to analyze for us to go public with it.
So if you had the same amount of money going forward, but you wanted to reprioritize how you target that money, what would you do?
Well, I think we've already begun to do that. I think we have to place much more emphasis on not looking at this problem as an individual youth problem. It is an individual youth problem, but the solution requires a multi-generational family solution. So it's really about retooling the focus of what the medicine that we apply gets applied to. And in this case, we're finding that the more family members we engage, the more effective this work is.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, go ahead.
Hey, Guillermo, you mentioned earlier when you were referring to the Brotherhood Crusade that I want to say you said 85% of they direct towards prevention.
Mhm.
But do they have an intervention component as well? Or will we in those areas still have an intervention?
Well, we do have intervention, and Brotherhood Crusade collaborates with intervention agencies that work in that area. I would say the collaboration in that area between intervention and prevention is pretty seamless. I think there's an overall sense of people looking at these solutions as comprehensive. So while they do prevention, the line between prevention and intervention is a thin one. So once a youth is at that point that he or she becomes gang involved, then there's collaboration with the intervention agencies.
I'm good.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you very much for your presentation and all the work you've been doing to get us to this point. I'll open it up for public comment. Are there any public comment cards on this item?
No.
Okay, I just want to announce that public comment on item number 1 is now open. Is there anybody else here who would like to make public comment on item number 1? Seeing and hearing no one come forward, public comment on this item is now closed. Public comment has been satisfied on this item. Okay, so with that, we'll move to approve the Mayor's Grid Office recommendations and also subject to concurrence by the CAO. So by the time we get it to the council on Friday, we should have opinions of the CAO as well. Okay? Thank you all very, very much.
Thank you all.
That concludes the items for today's agenda. We've already opened up general public comment for this committee, so that's already been satisfied. Therefore, this committee is now adjourned.
You doing good?